recorded. So thank you very much for joining us. I'm personally very excited about our conversation tonight. I'm really looking forward to it. I mentioned we have competition with the White House peace agreement being signed tonight. We didn't really plan on that, but I think it is very fitting for our conversation. It will be interesting to hear ramifications about peace processes and women being involved in negotiations, etc. For those who don't know me, my name is Tanya Morkes. I'm the director of Dvorah, which is an Israeli NGO promoting women in national security and foreign policy. Thank you very much to our colleagues in the Canadian Embassy in Tel Aviv and in Canada's Global Affairs for helping to facilitate. And thank you very much, Ambassador O'Neill and Israel Oron for tonight's conversation. You will have the chance to ask some questions at the second part of our meeting. So if you'd like to just type it into a chat and I'll be choosing the questions. And depending on the time, we'll probably have between 3 and 5 questions. And I'll ask you to ask the question directly, but if you could just post it in the group chat and then I'll be able to choose which questions we'd like raised. So feel free to do that. So just a few quick words about Forum Dvorah before we begin, and whoever doesn't know about our organization, I really encourage you to go online later on to our website or contact me directly. I'll put my email and our website in the chat as well, and you can feel free to stay in touch with us and learn more about our activities. But just a few words. So we're a nonpartisan and nonprofit NGO with a network of about 500 plus professional women in national security and foreign policy. Our participants come from a variety of opinions and backgrounds, and it's very important for us to have that diversity. We were established in 2009 with the support of the Institute for Inclusive Security, which we'll be discussing tonight, and which was founded by Ambassador Swani Hunt to promote the inclusion of women in national security and decision-making processes. And Ambassador O'Neill was president of Inclusive Security and played a very significant role in the creation of what became Forum Dvorah. It became Forum Dvorah in 2015 as an independent nonprofit here in Israel. So Forum Dvorah's vision is the equal representation of women in decision-making circles and positions within the fields that I mentioned, national security and foreign policy, based on the understanding that this equal representation of men and women is crucial to enhance Israel's national security. We greatly believe in the power of the network. Just like there's a boys club, there's a women's club or a men's club, or a girls club or a women's club, and we support each other and our members to promote women and open doors for each other. And that's a major part of our activities. Our members are both leading figures in national security and in foreign policy, and we also support the next generation of women in mid-level management positions and the younger women coming into these fields. So we have a mentorship program and a separate program for them, which about 100 members strong and growing by word of mouth. I would say that's probably our flagship program. Really proud of that. We also work to broaden Israel's national security discourse and diversify the participants and the topics considered national security. And I'm sure we'll be speaking about what is considered national security as well tonight. Resilience, which is an extremely important topic in this day and age, especially during Corona pandemic, which we've seen all around the world. So I'll gladly give the floor in a second to Israela and to Jackie. Maybe just a few words, introduction about each one, and then I'll pass the mic over to you guys. So Ambassador O'Neill was appointed Canada's first ambassador for women, peace and security in June 2019. And as we mentioned before, we were lucky enough to meet with you right before your appointment at the Canadian Ambassador's residence in Tel Aviv. You advised, Jacqueline advised the government of Canada on the country's first and second national action plan, which I'm very jealous of because Israel doesn't have a national action plan as yet. I'm hoping that in the next coming months, we'll be working towards that. And prior to becoming ambassador, Jackie served as the president of the Institute for Inclusive Security and supported coalitions for national strategies and policy for women in Colombia, South Sudan, Pakistan, NATO, and the UN. Ambassador O'Neill helped found the, correct me if I'm saying it wrong, Romeo Dallaire Child Soldiers Initiative. I say it right. To eliminate the use of children during conflict. And prior to that, the ambassador was policy advisor to Canada's Secretary of State for Asia Pacific region. She was also a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center, Canada's Institute, and an adjacent professor at the Georgetown University. Brigadier General Israel Aharon is one of Forum Dvorah's founding members. She served as Deputy National Security Advisor at Israel's National Security Council. Prior to joining the National Security Council, she was director at PricewaterhouseCoopers Israel, where she established and led the organization's strategy department. Israel served in the IDF for more than 27 years in various key positions, including as the first woman appointed deputy spokesperson for the IDF, and the first woman to serve as a faculty member of the National Defense College. At her last appointment in the IDF, she served as head of the IDF's Women's Corps, where she promoted reforms and namely eliminated the separate IDF Women's Corps. Very crucial to gender equality in the IDF. Israela is also on the board of Commanders for Israel Security, the Geneva Initiative, Acharai, and also on the steering committee for Ben Gurion University. So over to you, Israela.
Good evening to everybody. 3 years ago, I have participated in Halifax in a conference, international security conference. By the way, one of the most distinguished conferences about security in the world. And coming from Israel, I felt as if I was landing in an entirely different planet. And why is it so? Because there were panels there discussing security. And the first thing that I noticed that there was no panel without a woman. The second thing is, many of the panels had quite a majority of women. And there was even one panel, as I recall, that it was all women panel. No, the moderator was a Canadian general, which was hilarious. And then on the top of it, the Defense Minister of Canada dedicated at least half of his speech to the issue of women in security in Canada, how he wants to promote them and how he wants to integrate them, etc., etc., etc. It was very impressive. So having said that, I would like to ask you, Ambassador O'Neill, why and how did Canada end up with an ambassador for women, peace and security? It's not as if you already achieved all the goals.
Thanks, Israel. I'm going to answer your question. I just want to say thanks first to Tanya, and hi to you, hi Etty, hi all of the other colleagues that I met in previous trips, and hi to everybody that I'm meeting for the first time. And I can't help but say, if you want to put your video on, please do so. This is a space where if you have children running into the picture, or you're folding laundry or doing anything like that, I want you to feel very welcome and comfortable. It's sometimes hard to do all these events and it feels like you're just speaking into a black hole. So it's so nice to see your faces and know that you're on. You certainly don't have to, but I really appreciate that you're all joining this evening, and it's so nice to see so many of you. And before I answer your great question, Israel, I want to make sure to introduce some Canadian colleagues who are on the call, especially my colleague David Murphy-Hagland, the first secretary at our Canadian embassy, given that some of you may have met him or will soon meet him. I don't know if you're able to see him on the screen. There's David, he can give you a wave. And I think we have a few other colleagues here based in Ottawa as well. Wilson, I don't know if you're there. Brody, Chris, perhaps you're there. If you can give us a wave. There's Brody, hi.
Hi.
And anybody else from Global Affairs apart from my team, who we'll introduce in a sec. Just give us a wave so you all know who you are. And then also from my staff, we have John St. Dennis and Rowena Williams, who I'll point out in particular because A, they're fantastic, and B, they're seconded from our Department of Defense and Canadian Armed Forces to work with the Ambassador for Women, Peace and Security. So just so you all know who these additional folks on the call are. Okay, so Israel, you landed on Mars and you saw a country with a focus on women, peace and security, which makes me very happy. But of course, the work is never done and we have lots more to do. How did we end up here? So the concept of women, peace and security has been important to Canada for many, many years. So you all know the formative UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which passed 20 years ago. Canada, when we last sat on the UN Security Council, we were very strong advocates of that resolution. So that was led by Namibia officially, and it was supported by Bangladesh, by Jamaica, and by Canada. So for a long time, we've had this interest in kind of our fingerprints on that. And that resolution came at a time that Canada was very focused on this concept of human security, which I know many of you have talked about as well. And about 20 years ago, that was a big area of focus for our government. And it was also in line with a lot of what was happening domestically in Canada. And we can talk much more about this, but part of the reason we have this focus in defense, foreign policy, and other aspects is because we've had increasing attention to gender, to women, to inclusion domestically, and they've gone really hand in hand. So those became parts of our international engagements for many years. And we also started doing something in Canada called Gender-Based Analysis Plus. And over about 25 years, we've been doing this practice. It's a tool of analysis where we look at every policy, every practice, every possible initiative, and think about how it might differently affect men, women, boys, girls, and people with other identities. So people who are older, people who are younger, people who are from various different religions, minorities, ethnic groups, differing abilities, gays and lesbians, etc. And so we started doing that practice, and it became more and more normal for our government to think about how different policies both impact and are impacted by women. So like about 83 other countries, and I know not Israel, Canada now has a national action plan on women, peace and security. We had our first plan introduced in 2011. And then the second one was introduced about 5 years later in 2017, 6 years. And it's a 5-year plan. So 2017 to 2022, we have a national action plan on women, peace and security. So my position was not called for in the first national action plan, but we have a really vibrant civil society in Canada. And they had advocated for a long time to have a dedicated champion, they called it, for women, peace and security, someone to really keep up the focus internally. And represent externally. And they worked, they advocated to government, and they also worked with members of parliament. So parliament passed a motion to create the position of Ambassador for Women, Peace and Security. So we then had the foreign minister announce, this was about 2018, that they'd be appointing someone to this role, that they'd be creating an Ambassador for Women, Peace and Security. And in summer of 2019, so last summer, the cabinet created an order in council, and the prime minister appointed me to a 3-year term. So that's how we ended up with this position of Ambassador for Women, Peace and Security.
So how did you end up?
Are you questioning my appointment, Israel?
No.
Funny, it's a question I ask myself pretty much every day. So I did something that was not very, I like to call it not very woman-y of me, which was that I actually suggested myself for the role. And I'll note that if it had not been for my husband, I may not have done it. And I know this is not a webinar on relationships or anything like that, but I'll just say to everyone that you don't need a life partner, but if you're going to choose one, you should choose one who is extremely supportive and not threatened by you and actually supports you, because it was him who said to me, you know, if you were to think about, like, imagine someone else getting this position and someone who was less passionate about this work, or someone who maybe had no experience, just imagine how you'd feel about that. And so that urged me to do it. So very briefly, so I come from civil society myself. I grew up in Western Canada and worked a little bit for the government in Ottawa, but always kind of on the margins. And then I did a master's degree, and I had 3 really formative experiences. So the first formative experience was that I spent several months working in Khartoum in Sudan. And I worked for 3 days a week at an all-women's university and 3 days a week at the UN peacekeeping mission. And they were basically like ships passing in the night. So they were working on very similar issues, but they didn't have connection points between them. So I saw massive capacity of women at the university who were doing things like working on transitional constitutions and discussing the implementation of the peace agreement that had just been signed. And then I saw groups organized through the UN that were working on very, very similar things, but were almost exclusively men at the time. This was around 2005. And I saw that there just wasn't a connection between them. And I felt like maybe that was a space that I could be useful in. The second really formative one was that I worked with General Romeo Dallaire, who you mentioned. He was a fellow when I was doing my master's degree, and I went to him and basically said, can I transcribe the phone book for you? Can I do anything for you? He was Canada's force command, he was the UN force commander in Rwanda during their genocide, and he's Canadian. And so he came back and he talked a lot about the failures of the UN. He talked about what he faced. He talked about all the, the horror of genocide and what a country like Canada, what responsibilities we have. And he was very focused on working with child soldiers and working with military communities on the issue of child soldiers. And so that to me was my first interaction working with military communities in particular. And the third really formative experience was that I met Ambassador Swanee Hunt, who was a professor. And many of you know Ambassador Swanee and have met her over her time there. And she founded the Institute for Inclusive Security. And she dedicated her, her wealth and her time to getting more women involved in decision-making about peace and security all around the world. And so I met her, was quite amazed by her, and ended up going to work for her right after graduate school. So I was at Inclusive Security for 13 years. We worked with many coalitions, including many with Israeli and Palestinian women. We did research, advocacy, national action plans, etc. And through that time, I'd always maintained my connection with the Canadian government to some degree anyway. We did an assessment of their first national action plan. I advised on some other initiatives that they were creating. And then when I heard that they were forming this position, I basically did my own advocacy campaign. So I did what we worked on together, many of us on this call. I mapped the decision makers. I figured out who was responsible for ultimately deciding, did I know them? What connections did I have to them? And I reached out to many of them, again, in a very uncomfortable way, and said, I hope you'd consider me for this job. Here's what I think it could involve, and here's why I think I would be suitable for it. And then over at least a year or two, almost 2 years, I heard virtually nothing and basically gave up. And then about a year and a half ago, I got a phone call, and they said, you're on a short list. Are you still interested in the position? And I said, I can be there tomorrow if you'll still have me. So that's the long story, Israel, of how it happened, but it came from civil society. And it's very unusual in Canada to come from outside directly into a role like this. We have very few politically appointed ambassadors or heads of mission, and I'm appointed through cabinet. So I never actually thought I'd be able to come into the Canadian government directly from civil society. So it's just been a complete dream.
I think we need another webinar entire one, to teach young women how to do it, because it's really a challenge for many of them.
Yeah, and it doesn't feel natural. And I owe it to people like you and others who encourage me to do things like that. But it's a good lesson that sometimes you should just need to put yourself forward.
So after you got this job, I wonder, what exactly do you do? What does an ambassador for women, peace, and security do?
Okay, so it's definitely an unusual concept in that it's most ambassadors are to a place, not to a theme or an issue. And most ambassadors are based outside of the country, whereas I am here in Ottawa. My job overall is basically to try to help our entire government make sure that we're building thinking about women's inclusion into everything that we do. And I'll break that down a little bit more. So the primary part of my mandate, which was approved by cabinet, is to provide, it says, confidential advice to ministers who are overseeing our National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. So in Canada, what we right now have 8 departments and 1 agency that have commitments in our National Action Plan. So I report essentially primarily to the Ministers of Foreign Affairs and Defense, as well as the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And then I also have responsibility to provide advice to the ministers of 6 additional partners. And what's interesting about our National Action Plan in particular is that we have included some departments that are primarily domestically focused. So I think we all know the kind of dirty secret of National Action Plans for many years has been that there have been roughly 2 types. There's been the type of what we would call conflict-affected countries, and that was mainly a domestic focus on reforming the security sector, on education, on reconciliation, on justice, etc. And then there was more the donor type, that where women, peace and security was almost viewed exclusively through the lens of being defense policy or foreign policy. And so I think Canada's National Action Plan is one of few, but one of increasing number of plans that are bringing those 2 together. So we have, it's coordinated by Global Affairs, but we have a range of departments that include public safety, they include immigration, justice, and then crucially, they also include Indigenous Services Canada and what we call Crown Indigenous and Northern Affairs. So we're engaging with the issue that many, many women, in particular Indigenous women within Canada, still face tremendous systemic discrimination. There are tremendous barriers to their full participation. So what I'm trying to do is a range of things within that, within my role. So one is trying to coordinate to some degree among these implementing partners. So we don't necessarily yet, we're not at a place where we're necessarily sharing a lot of information across departments. We're not sharing resources to the extent that we can. And there's tons of great work being done in different departments, but I think there's a little more space for coordinating that to some degree. Another thing I'm working on is trying to support the creation of really customized tools, resources, guidance, training, etc. So, you know, as you mentioned, Israela, there's a lot of awareness of women, peace and security and the importance of it within the Canadian government and within our civil society, et cetera. And I think a challenge of an area that we're at right now is that, and this is pervasive around the world, I think, is that we see, if people seem to believe in the importance of an issue, we sometimes automatically assume that they know how to implement it. So what I think, what we're working on right now is trying to get more customized guidance or training materials for people across our department. So we have, or our government, so we have a baseline of training, but what does it mean to think about gender and climate change, gender and cyber, women's inclusion in peace negotiations? What do we know works? What has not worked? What are some tactics that have been used that have been most effective? What are resources available, networks, et cetera? So to support people who are trying to do really good work and may just need a little extra resource support from the government. And then the last area of major work is trying to support Canadian initiatives related to women, peace and security. So there's some really fantastic ways that Canada around the world, through our missions, our diplomats, and Canadian civil society, are trying to increase the implementation of this broad agenda. And I'm trying to help however I can to make those successful. So either speaking at events, helping in the design or coordination of some of them, trying to connect them with people who make sense, et cetera, et cetera. So what you're hearing from me is that I have a broad mandate, which for me is great because then I feel like I can navigate that gray space a little bit. For some people, it's a little bit confusing, and I think some people expect that I'm basically like an ombudsperson or someone who's reporting on the government's implementation, but I'm actually sitting within the government, so that would be a fairly poor design for accountability if I were reporting on the government from within the government. What I'm trying to do is basically be, as we're trying to call me like a force multiplier for the Canadian government to implement its women, peace, and security commitments.
I wonder, is it possible at all, or do you have quantitative goals with regard to your position?
Yeah, we have a few, and I can share some of them. They're just being confirmed by some of our leadership, so I don't want to scoop them by sharing too much here, but they relate to things like increasing the commitments that we have made under our National Action Plan. So we heard very clearly we don't want to have a new national action or like a new policy being created, but each department has an implementation strategy. So some of the goals relate to increasing the commitments made under that. Then various departments have commitments. So for example, it's not entirely under the National Action Plan, but our Department of Defense set a target of having 25% women in the forces by the year 2025. So we have varying types of quantitative commitments across the different departments.
So I would like to be up to date. As a matter of fact, up to this moment, we are in the process of signing a peace treaty with the UAE right now in the White House. This is why some of our participants are watching now President Trump's speech, but it's okay with me. And I wonder, with regard to the UAE treaty, the peace treaty, I couldn't ignore the fact that there were few women involved in this. And now we are going to establish relationships with the UAE and maybe with Bahrain and maybe with other countries. And I wonder, what advice can you give to us in Israel? How can we be part of this process?
I'm very glad you raised it, mentioning that it's happening at the moment. And I hope we can discuss this or have more comments from participants about this too, because you will know best. Always, I have that caveat. A couple of thoughts or ideas based on the little bit that I do know of the status of the process, as well as what's been possible in a few other places. So, I think in terms of the UAE, the deal with the UAE, and again, please take this with grains of salt. This is me doing my best to give ideas, only ideas.
No, I don't mean the UAE in particular, but how can we be more involved in processes like this?
Well, I think I'll use it as a specific example because right now I'd say there's opportunities related to both track 1 and track 2. So track 1 being the direct negotiations related between governments in particular, and then track 2 being more people-to-people exchanges. So track 1, I mean, as I understand it, the framework and the agreement is signed as a framework. There's still, I presume, a great deal of detail to be worked out. So sub-agreements, committees to be formed, et cetera. So there's still a lot of work left to do. And I think that's one thing that many people kind of overlook with respect to negotiations, that often the big handshake moment is not the entirety. And as we always say, the devil's in the details, right? So with respect to the work that is still to come, I'd say there are two main areas to focus on. One is the representation of women in the actual decision-making positions. So are there committees being formed? Are there working groups for various additional sub-agreements? You know, what is the actual governance of how those are being drafted? And do you have sufficient representation of women on those? And of course, you know, not just women, but women representing a variety of different perspectives. So looking at that. So the first one is representation. And then the second one is thinking about, and I'd propose using a tool like gender-based analysis plus to assess potential outcomes of the overarching agreement or of any sub-agreements that come out. So, so for example, you know, Canada has what we call our feminist foreign policy. Part of that is doing a gender-based analysis plus on every aspect of our international relations. Includes things like trade, includes our defense strategy, not just international assistance, but every aspect of our engagement. We do it domestically as well. So I would suggest, as all of you basically know how to do, and you call it gender-based analysis plus, but doing an analysis of how the agreement or the proposed issues on the table might both be affected through the participation of different groups and what kind of different effects they might have on different groups. And I know that's a little bit theoretical, but we'd be happy to share some examples of gender-based analysis plus, et cetera. But, you know, I think sometimes we, in advocacy communities, we work so hard to have people represented that we forget that they need additional supportive analysis. And that, of course, women at the table doesn't equal having a strong gender perspective or analysis on an agreement. And you can do that through more systematic analysis. And of course, it yields things such as, you know, people in rural areas may be advantaged by this aspect of a trade agreement or not. Or, you know, if there's a dimension related to cyber relations, for example, how might that affect men and women differently? There are all kinds of ways that gender and all that it involves can appear in different types of agreements or aspects related to agreements. And so I'd suggest in the track one, you know, front, thinking both about representation as well as doing something related to like a gender-based analysis plus. And then of course, track two, and again, I'd love to hear more about this, but I presume there's a lot of opportunity for engaging with citizens, with community members in either the UAE or Bahrain or in the region to sensitize each other about what might your priorities be, but then also to be discussing agreements back at home. And I'm curious to hear, you know, your thoughts on the agreements overall, et cetera, but having women involved in the public's perception of agreements has been really, really crucial. Often when the public sees that women are involved and support agreements, they become much more trusting of the agreement itself. So again, I don't know if that's going to be the case in Israel, but I think it's really crucial to engage with, for example, women in the UAE or in Bahrain.
Sometimes I wonder if it happens in Canada, but I think no. I am accused of trying to force this way of thinking, like to find a feminist angle in something that doesn't have any gender implication at all. And it happens quite often. Are you familiar with this?
Yes, and I never accept it. I say sometimes that like I think one of my, we all have gifts that we're born with. I think one of mine, I have very few. One of them is being able to identify gender dimensions of almost everything. And I guarantee you, if you talk to the right people, you will find them. There is not a subject I have found that does not have a dimension related to gender.
So it brings me to my next question. Does COVID-19, the fight of Canada with COVID-19 have this feminist dimension?
Absolutely.
Feminine dimension?
Absolutely, absolutely. So, you know, I mentioned we have a feminist foreign policy. We also have practiced gender-based analysis plus at home for a long time. We have a self-declared feminist government, et cetera. And that results in a number of things. One of them being that whenever something major happens, for the most part, our bureaucracy, our civil service does not need to start by trying to prove that there will be a gendered dimension or that it might affect men and women differently, for example. So it means as a government, we know that there will be, that men and women, boys and girls, different communities will be affected differently, and we have to figure out how. So even with COVID-19, in the first few weeks of the crisis, in March, essentially when it got especially acute, we were doing gender-based analysis plus, and it was discovering a whole range of things that many of which I'm sure are very similar in Israel. So roughly 70% of frontline healthcare workers are women. So they were especially vulnerable to being exposed. The majority of the industries affected were dominated by women. So retail, hospitality, restaurants, that kind of thing. We saw, as I'm sure you did, really immediate impact on women as schools were being canceled. So for the most part, women still maintain primary caregiving responsibilities, and that affected their ability to continue working in their professional employment. And then it was also really obvious from the start that women were likely, not all women are safer in the home. So we're encouraging people to stay in the home for lockdowns. And the home is not a safe place for many women, many LGBTQ youth, a whole range of children. So even in the first tranche of funding, we had about $50 million dedicated to domestic violence shelters across the country. So we're still breaking it down. There's still tons of ways that we're looking at the gender dimensions of COVID. Even as we've rolled out government support programs, are women more likely to access them than men? Are they more likely to go online? Are there certain ones they're seeking out or using versus others? What about people with disabilities? What about people in rural communities versus urban ones? What are Indigenous communities needing? How are those needs different from what the kind of broader policies might be, those in the north, et cetera? Even our finance minister talked about how in 2008, the financial crisis was something, they were all trying to prevent a recession. She said in 2008, we had a he-cession because most of the industries that were affected were predominantly male dominated. So manufacturing, construction, about 70% of the people who were unemployed as a result of the recession in 2008 were men. And she talks about now, post-COVID, we're trying to prevent a she-cession where the majority of industry, the majority of people affected in negative ways in terms of the rebuilding are women. So absolutely, it's been a huge thing. And I'm not trying to convey that we've done everything perfectly. Of course, there are ways that we can improve, et cetera. But I feel really, convinced and extremely strongly that having this perspective from the outset has been really formative. And I think Canada was actually one of the only countries that had more than 50% women in its official COVID response body. So we had a official COVID committee, and we had just over 50% women in that committee. And I think we all know the relationship between representation and the presence of that type of analysis. Again, it's not perfect. There are still many gaps, but it's something that I'm very proud of.
And you are considered to be a green country.
A green country?
Yes, it means that because we are red. A red country.
In terms of our infection rates. Yes. Yes, I'm sorry to hear that things are looking so challenging for you.
So maybe
our rates are going up, but we're doing better. Maybe
it has to do with the proportion of women in the decision-making bodies. But
there's been some research that's come out. So CARE, the international organization CARE, did a big study of about 30 countries and looked at the proportion of women in these COVID response, leading COVID high-level committees, and then looked at the quality of their responses and found that there was a correlation between them. There's also been now an academic peer-reviewed study that's come out that's looked at women leaders of countries and their responses to COVID and the way that's impacted. Of course, there are all kinds of dynamics to take into consideration, but that study in particular found that there was a relationship between the gender of the leader and the country's success and response. So again, I would never say all women leaders will result in the following, but I think we know that if we have a government that values the diversity of voices and has more representative voices directly informing them, you're going to get better policies.
Okay, you will take a little break, and I would like to ask, to remind everybody that we are going to celebrate, and you already mentioned it, in October, 20 years to 1325, which was a breakthrough. And later we'll discuss the issue if we should celebrate or do something else. But still, I would like to invite former MK and one of the founders of Forum Dvorah, Eti Livni, to refresh our memory with regard to 1325 and to tell us about her specific role, turning it into an Israeli law. Eti, please. And it's not true that it's written Israel Aron, and she's not Israel Aron, she's Eti.
She is muted, I think.
And she is muted.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Jackie. I'm glad to see you again and to hear and how important work you are doing in Canada. Chapeau, really. Israel asked me to refer again to 1325, but I believe that every one of us that is presented here knows quite well about 1325. And as you mentioned, one of the formative encounters I had was with Swanee Arndt as well. I came to Boston and I was exposed to this 1325 decision. I learned about it. And when I came to Israel in 2005, I came before, of course, but in 2005, the civil society organization were aware of the 1325, and they approached me and Yuli Tamir, another MK, with the idea of having law or that mentions 1325 and trying to implement it in the Israeli law. And slowly we became enthusiastic about it. And it was a good time for us to try to enact this and to make it a part of our law, because I was the head then of the Committee of Women, Advancement of Women, and Tzipi Livni was the Minister of Justice. And both of us tried to promote this issue. Nobody knew what that means at all. So it was easy just to enact it. And we have it as a part of our law, the 1325, that means inclusion of women in all issues, in all committees, in all negotiations about dealing with security, with solution to conflicts, dealing with conflicts. And also we enlarged and broadened the scope of this decision, dealing with all kinds of issues that are strategic to the country we are in. And also we added at that time, and you mentioned it in your presentation, variety of women. It's very important that women that are involved in these issues won't be the same ones all the time. And we have the same, women that are involved in these issues, but we broaden the scope of in the law, in our bill, to include other women too, Arabs and others, all kinds of women. The question is now whether this bill, which is really, it was the first and I believe the only one in the world that implemented it in its law, in the legal system, does it make a difference? And I don't know, it's a complex answer. From one side, when you look at let's see at the Washington event now, you don't see many women there. I don't see any of them at the TV. I don't know how many were involved in this process, but except of the Netanyahu. But on the other hand, there is a lot of awareness in the Israeli society, and the bill gave a tool to all kinds of organizations to try to implement the inclusion of women in all these issues of security and foreign affairs and the strategic issue. So we have the tool to approach the Supreme Court of Israel when we see that there is no enough representation of women in these issues. And we have few good examples of applying to the Supreme Court and having a judgment that women should be included in all these issues. It's not always followed, but we are trying, and it came to the awareness of the people in government. From time to time, there is a kind of a move towards including more women. Just now, there was a letter written by the Attorney General to all the ministries to have women, to include women in the higher position in the government, in the offices. So it's a long way. It's a long way work. It's a long way commitment. But I think things are becoming a bit better. So with this law, with this awareness of the Israeli society, of the women of the Israeli society, I think we are improving. You mentioned the role or the success of women leaders in the COVID times now, pandemic. So we were discussing it too, that as you mentioned, the lot of prime ministers around the world, or prime ministers that are women, are dealing better in the COVID-19, handling the pandemic. And of course, we know the New Zealand and Denmark and Germany and Taiwan, it's not a woman, and Finland and some others, they are doing better because the empathy, because they are caring, because they are explaining, because they are including the public, and they are sharing. And unfortunately, in Israel, that is now number one in this situation of pandemic, the public is not a part of it, and the decisions are not taken properly. So let's hope there will be women or more women in this area too. Thank you.
Amen. Thank you, Etty, and thank you for the law. And my first conclusion was that after making this law, you need a very strong Supreme Court to defend it. So this is one of my conclusions. But I would like to ask Ambassador O'Neill, do you have any counterparts around the world that are doing the same job?
Sort of. I have in Norway and at the African Union, there are special envoys for women, peace, and security who are essentially, identical. And then there are a number of ambassadors for gender equality or for women and girls, et cetera. So I think we've recently formed a group. We just started assembling email addresses of people we knew who had very similar portfolios. And there are about 30 of us or so who are in a position that's dedicated to this at roughly this level. And the most recent one I found interesting was South Korea, about a few weeks or maybe a few months ago, named an ambassador for gender equality. And she also came from civil society, which was a neat thing. And she's focused, of course, on all aspects domestically, as well as negotiations between North and South Korea and ensuring inclusion there. So she could be an interesting future speaker for the group. So
I suppose that we are waiting for the first conference of the ambassadors for women, peace, and security.
And with an Israeli participant as well. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I hope that one of the members will be from Israel.
Agreed. I hope, Etty, that you'll be pleased. Many of you know the United States in 2016 passed the Women, Peace, and Security Act. So the US Congress, with bipartisan support, both houses of Congress passed the Women, Peace, and Security Act. And one of the things it did or does is call for a national strategy around women, peace, and security, effectively a national action plan. And Etty, I bring this up because I was living in the US then, and we heard all the time, and you will still hear today, many Americans tell you that the US Congress was the first legislative body, national legislative body, that took up the issue of 1325. And I always put a little asterisk on that, and I say, well, not technically. In fact, my friend Etty Livni in Israel in, what was it, 2008? 5, there you go, 2005. Had legislation that passed as well, that, again, neither of them, they're not identical, but I like to point that out, that there's an asterisk on that claim by the US these days.
This brings me to one issue that is about, okay, we have a law, we have this UN resolution, in some countries, we even have nation plans about women, and it looks as if we are on the right way. However, I'm really concerned about the monitoring of those laws and those resolutions. And I believe that your job is somehow to do some kind of a monitoring, or am I wrong? So in order to really implement those laws, do we need in every country, my question is, what do we need?
Mm-hmm. My answer will always be a strong civil society. We need a lot of things within government to ensure that the tracking happens and that there's leadership to make it happen. But maybe coming from civil society and then now within, seeing the importance of civil society on this issue in particular, always strong civil society. So I guess I'd say a few other things. And maybe this gets into the question of, how do we know if we're making progress on this? Because we're in this anniversary period, and we have both a desire, I think many of us have a desire to celebrate the progress that we've made and recognize that there's still a long way to go. And so globally, there's a lot of assessment going on right now about how are we monitoring what's going, our accomplishments. And, if I can share what I see and what I've heard through this, collective analysis in a couple of areas. So definitely there are a lot of positives. So we have seen now at the United Nations that the Security Council started with Security Council Resolution 1325. There are now 10 similar resolutions. So the Security Council 10 different times has referenced women's inclusion and the importance of women's voices in prevention, in rebuilding after violent conflict, sexual violence, preventing violent extremism, a whole range of things. There are a range of plans and strategies at the UN. There are a range of other multilateral organizations. It's not just the UN. NATO has a strategy. The Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe has one. The African Union has what they call a continental results framework. So to your point, Israela, what they're trying to do is develop some indicators that are common across all of the countries in Africa that have national action plans, which happen to be right now the majority of countries in Africa. So, we're getting better at these frameworks or these strategies or plans. As I think I mentioned, there are 84 approximately countries in the world that have national action plans or strategies. And I think what they've really done for many places and many people in civil society is provided a hook for advocacy. So you can look at, the Afghan negotiations right now, the Taliban and the Afghan government. The Taliban has no female negotiators. The Afghan government now has 4 female negotiators. Afghan women were saying, we have a national action plan. We are part of the international community, which values women's inclusion. That was one of the hooks that they use. It's one of the hooks many people use. So we have these frameworks. The gaps, though, are still tremendous. And one of the biggest ones relates to funding and resourcing. So of all of the national action plans that exist, 20% only are funded or have budgets associated with them. So 4 out of 5 national action plans are plans that involve actions by different people across government, but do not necessarily have resources that are allocated to them. And I had a conversation just last week with Canada's new ambassador to the United Nations, and we talked about this, and he said, I've always said that a plan without a budget is a hallucination. And I said, well, I guess there's a lot of hallucinations around women, peace, and security out there. So the budget for the plans themselves is one issue. Funding for women's civil society organizations. We talk about the crucial aspect of civil society, but women's civil society organizations are still very much, as you all know, kind of projectized, where we haven't said, your work is crucial, you need to be able to adapt to crises like COVID, but instead we're funding people based on projects. And often I hear over and over, peace is not a project. We have to be in place and we have to have core and predictable funding. I think we haven't had much focus or nearly enough focus on conflict prevention, which has been a core part of 1325, right? So I think we've pivoted a little bit towards the inclusion of women in security forces and not nearly enough on the role of women in inclusion in preventing armed conflicts. And, you know, a lot of our metrics are still just not where they need to be. We still have something like 50% of the parties to conflict around the world that we can credibly and presume have been involved in sexual violence, not on the agenda of the Security Council. We have record levels of political violence targeting women peace builders, women political candidates, women in the public space generally. Levels of violence against them are increasing. And then, you know, I often cite this very sad statistic, is that if you think of the proportion of women in uniformed position across the United Nations, women are half the world. They make up less than 5% of women in uniformed positions serving in United Nations peacekeeping missions. So less than 5% of UN troops, police or military, are women. So, you know, we're just not where I think many people hoped we'd be at this stage. And while there have been a lot of great areas of progress, I think it relates maybe a little bit to what Eti said, that at the start, people may not have taken seriously this concept of 1325. Like you said, people didn't know what it was, so they were kind of like, yeah, okay, fine. But I think as it grew in importance, maybe it became a little more obvious how potentially transformative it could be and how challenging it could be to traditional power structures. And I think we're seeing some significant pushback right now on the idea of inclusion as being a core part of governance. And I think that's a reflection of the power of the idea and also the fragility of the progress that we've made. I'm sorry I went on. That was a very long answer to a quick question.
It was the right answer. And I'm a little bit encouraged, but as you know, I'm still skeptic, as always. But at this point, I would like to allow our participants to ask you some questions about your work and other things. And Tanya, will you be so kind to moderate this?
With pleasure. So we have 4 questions. We have 2 questions on 1325. One actually is directed to you, Israela, and one to you, Jackie. So Pascal Chen, you want to ask your question?
Yes. Hi, hello everybody. Thank you very much, Ambassador Israela and Eti, for your remarks and a lot of knowledge you just gave us. And I just wanted to ask the ambassador if she could give us some advice to Israeli women about things, strategies or actions we could do as women in civil society to have an influence on the implementation of the National Action Plan in Israel. And I just want to stress the fact that we are from the civil society. I'm a member of Women Wage Peace, and I'd like to know how we could do something to make a change, to influence our society on this domain.
Great. Do you want me to answer that, or do you want to go to Israela first?
Okay, so sure, because I think it's a complementary question. So Chris Halter, you had a question for Israela also on 1325?
I do, but I'm on a train, so if the sound is terrible, you tell me. Thank you so much, Jackie, and thank you, Israela, for a very inspiring talk. My name is Chris. I'm from Sweden, also a good friend of Dvorah. Really appreciative of their work. Israela, we're so happy to hear about the law. I mean, I didn't know the details about it, but we heard from Jackie about their two national action plans. In Sweden, we have 3 now, but you know best, Israela, and all of you Israelis. What do you need to do to get to establish an action plan? And follow-up question to that: what can 1325 friendly countries such as Canada and Sweden, what can we do to help you? Thank you.
This is something that we all in Forum Dvorah are thinking about it for quite a while. In Israel, we have this problem of, this is the answer that we get. This is a very important issue. However, we are dealing right now with security threats, with other threats, and with political threats, and it's an unstable situation. And this is the answers that we get from the officials and the ministers and sometimes the prime minister. And I feel as if we are always at the end of the list. When everything will be okay, we'll get to you. And then we'll try to make a national action plan and deal with those issues. So what Eti Livni did together with Yuli Tamir to present this law was very important, because this is the only sticks that we can hold against decisions and actions that exclude women. And what Jackie said about the civil society is true, and I completely agree with it. We need to join forces with other organizations, not only women organizations. I do respect Itach Maki and also Shdulat Hanashim and many other women organizations. But we need to join forces with other organizations, not only female organizations, and to try to lobby and to convince the lawmakers and the politicians to allocate money for this kind of activity, because without money and without budget, nothing really will happen. This is one thing. And the other thing is that we really need some kind of sanctions. I think that you have them in some countries that have a national action plan. If you have only 2% of women in some positions, your budget is reduced. This had to be the policy of the government. Sadly enough, now we are in the middle of fighting the COVID-19 and other issues, and still this is not in the center of the attention of our government. I hope that in the near future, people will understand that the fact that women are excluded affects directly our success in fighting the COVID-19 and other issues as well. Also pure security issues. I can only hope it will happen soon. Thank you.
I can then add in, and I know that other people want to join in. So maybe Tanya, you can figure out how you want to bring in others on that to add to Israela's comments, and maybe also pick up on Chris's question about what can supportive governments, how can we outside help you in doing so. I'll just add 3 points that I found in my experience to add to Israela's excellent overview. One is really supporting, finding and cultivating and supporting internal champions. So, you know, a national action plan is never going to come to life unless you have a couple of senior level or mid to very senior level people within the departments who are going to push for it and are going to make it a priority. And of course, you know, we've had a national action plan under 2 different prime ministers. Some people, you know, say, oh, is this a Justin Trudeau thing, a Liberal government thing? I always emphasize we've had them under 2 different parties, the Conservative Party and the Liberal Party. And we've had some champions within our department who've kind of taken it on themselves and have worked very closely with civil society, who said, here are ways to push back on arguments. Here's research you can use. Here's an example that's most relevant to Canada's context. Here's how they did it somewhere else. Like, really spoon feed your champions with everything that they need to be internal advocates. And even my colleagues here from the Department of Defense and Canadian Armed Forces, we had Canada's Chief of Defense Staff, General Vance, who was on the panel that you mentioned, Israela. He became a very dedicated champion internally, and he was, you know, the most senior ranking male military officer, said, this is a priority for our forces and we're going to get this done. And without some really dedicated senior leadership, it doesn't have to be the very top, it helps, we wouldn't have the scale of impact I think that we have. Second point I'd say is, you know, the Knesset, I think, can have an important role. And I don't want to comment directly on the politics within Israel, but you know, this was a way in the United States, it was a way of ensuring that a national strategy would exist regardless of who was in the White House. And legislators played a really important role of saying every couple of years, we're going to have hearings, request progress status, and we need a national strategy. So I think the Knesset is an interesting option. And then to Israel, on your last point, I think the idea of incentives, both positive and negatives, are ones that we really haven't explored nearly enough in the area of women, peace, and security. So positive incentives, I think positive peer pressure is a really important thing. So who does Israel turn to? What, you know, what other countries, what political figures internationally are most respected, and how do we engage them to engage their counterparts? I think positive peer pressure and being part of a very cool club that has a national action plan on women, peace, and security, you know, getting to certain meetings, certain status, I think we can do more to make it appealing to have that. And then to your point, Israel, the biggest challenge I think on this whole agenda is accountability. And we have almost no accountability really anywhere for not implementing commitments in a national action plan, UN resolutions, et cetera. And we just see the consequences of this consistently. And that's something that in the next, hopefully not 20 years, but we have to get better at doing, is recognizing what are the consequences of not living this, even into an individual's career progression in their own department. And some of those can be related to personal incentives, but I've also become a big fan of things like those Twitter accounts that call out all male panels, you know, manels, that say, you know, that there's now one I think called Gender Avenger, and some others that say, okay, you're going to do an event, you're going to have only men speaking. We're going to tell, you know, 10,000 people who care about this, and now it's hundreds of thousands of people, and just make it less acceptable, kind of socially even, to be deeply exclusive. So totally agree, and I hope others chime in, but those were a couple additional things that I think we found in Canada and internationally.
So I'll chime in, and then I'll pass the floor minute to Neta Levy, who has a question. But I'll just chime in, and I've also mentioned this to your colleagues from Canada. I think it's very helpful that in meetings with Israeli counterparts that foreign diplomats mention this, the importance of a national action plan, and the fact that in other countries it exists, and the positivity and the things that the implications of a national action plan, and the fact that Israel doesn't have one, and the mentioning, like keeping to mention it and keeping the ball rolling on this really helps us in civil society when we go back and work with members of Knesset and they've already heard it from several different points of view, whether it's Israeli or foreign. I think that really helps us. So I think it's important to keep mentioning and keep passing the messages on in any meeting possible. Even if we're speaking about strict security issues, mention the National Action Plan, mention women, peace, and security. I think that really helps us. Neta, you had a question.
Before Neta, may I say something? I would like to pay a compliment to the Swedish government, and not because of Chris. The Swedish government refused, and I was involved in it, refused to accept Israeli delegation because there was no woman there. And I think this is a very good lesson. I know maybe it's not a diplomatic act, but it was very efficient.
There you go. I didn't know that. Neta, who's definitely a partner on trying to promote a national action plan for 1325. Mitach Ma'aki, your question?
Yes. Hi, thank you so much, Tanya. And thank you, Ambassador O'Neill and Israela. It was very, very fascinating and inspiring, and makes us envy you in Canada from time to time. I think I will follow up on what Israela and Tanya just said. And we are, Itach Ma'aki, our organization, is advancing the implementation of 1325 for many years in Israel. And one of my questions is, can Canada influence the participation of women from diverse backgrounds in track 2, at least, if not in track 1? Not only talking about the negotiations that are currently going on. The other question is, there is, I think, a lot of despair in Israel, and many are saying that we are advancing for many years. We're trying to have a national action plan, but even if we'll have a national action plan, it will not be implemented. So can you elaborate? Can you help us with arguments and elaborate on the direct positive effects that national action plans had in Canada or other countries, and that you saw with your own eyes?
Great question. I'll talk for a bit, in part to give my colleague David a chance, if he wants to say anything, to jump into about roles that a country like Canada or Sweden or others can play in influencing women's engagement in track 2. I can make an overarching statement that I know our mission is very much dedicated and determined to help support those connections, and has offered space in the past, has convened diverse groups before, and David can speak more to this, but is very much open to doing more of that in future, and providing maybe a more neutral space for some more challenging conversations to be had, or to at least initiate the conversations. But David can add in, and then Neta, I'd love to hear if you have any specific ideas about how we could do that, because we also want to, if you're thinking of something specific, by all means tell us, and we can talk about it. So David, I'm going to turn to you to see if you have anything to add, and then I'll get back to your second part of your question.
Thanks very much, Ambassador, and thanks everyone. It's been a fascinating discussion. I'm really here to learn, because I am probably the least expertise here. The one thing that I always tell all of our valuable partners is that we have financial constraints, as most of you I think know, so we can't give money, but we can give space, as the ambassador mentions. We can use our offices, we can try to make things happen, and throughout the network of the network of missions that we have, we can also collaborate. So I had, it's a little bit too early to mention this here, but I know Tanya had raised an idea, something we might be able to do, and we're interested in exploring this now. COVID has kind of, the last 6 months, I've basically been waiting for at the time when we can get people together, and that's now gone backwards. So I think it's safe to say we'll move forward looking on planning through remote kind of meetings like this. But please reach out to me. Tanya has my contact information and can share it around, and I'd love to meet with a lot of those of you whom I haven't already met as soon as we can to discuss ideas, and I will now listen to the ideas that are being shared here. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Annette, was there anything specific that you were hoping for, had in mind?
I think Israel's idea or example from Sweden is a good example, but because the international community is involved in some ways in the budget or the location or the demands from both sides. We can talk not only about Israel, but for example, the Colombian example and the peace negotiation there, and the international back that they got, supporting their demand for more women in both sides of the negotiation team was proven to be influential. Mm-hmm. So to have the demand to refuse accepting an agreement or a dialogue that does not have enough participation of women, at least 30% of women from diverse groups, and of course, as Tanya mentioned, bringing it up in every conversation, every international formal and informal encounter. These are my first ideas.
Great. And as you all have more, I'm sure David and our colleagues would love to hear them. To your question about selling a national action plan, it's a tough one. I think there are a range of things, and I would love to have you do a conversation like this with some members of Canadian civil society who, again, are just so effective. Like, we have a really tremendous group in civil society. Many of them work under an umbrella. It's called the Women, Peace and Security Network of Canada. I think it has 60 some members, some individual, some organizational. They're not the only ones that advocate on it, but it is a coalition that then tends to not speak with one voice, but coordinate some of the voices and strategies that they push for. So, they can tell you about some of the things that worked. I mean, what I try to do consistently about pushing for the implementation of the National Action Plan is really, I wish we were in a space where we could say women should have equal rights and therefore equal access, and we shouldn't have to make the case for their inclusion. And I wish we could reverse the argument and say, let's put the burden on those who are excluding to justify why we don't have representation in bodies that is even close to the representation we have in the rest of society, or why we have barriers like lack of access to childcare, or all kinds of things that prevent women from participating. But the reality is the burden is still, unfortunately, on us to make the case as to why we need these proactive policies. So fortunately, there is quite a lot of research about the benefit that comes from a diversity of thought. So I'm a big fan of drawing in research from industry and from the private sector about how teams function better when they have more diverse membership, different types of thinking. There's now a lot of information about how businesses have higher financial returns when they have a critical mass of women on boards. So research from the private sector. There's also now a lot of research about women related to peace and security. So all kinds of research about the likelihood of a peace agreement to endure if women are, it's 35% more likely to endure at least 15 years if women are play significant roles in drafting. And again, why is that? Because you uncover a broader set of issues. Many of them get at the root causes of conflict, et cetera. So getting at the positive benefits, and then also tying that back to that being a more effective use of resources. So, most people in positions of authority or influence care deeply about the money that they're spending. Are they getting value for that, for taxpayers' dollars, et cetera? So relating that back to, this is not an added thing that simply costs money. This means that the investment we make yields greater results. And so we're less likely to be involved in a longer period. We're more likely to get significant returns. We're more likely to have a community accepted development project that we're working on, all kinds of things that relate back to resource efficiency and coherence of our policies. And then lastly, I do think in terms of the plan, it is positive to be able to make it an appealing club, for lack of a better word, to be part of. But you know, these are countries that have national action plans. Their leaders have spoken about them in this way. You can find some specific examples of us saying, for example, it's helped us focus our plans. It helped us bring efficiencies by having a similar focus across different departments, et cetera, and then make it, as we said, like a source of positive peer pressure to join that group. But again, I don't know what would work best domestically, but those have been things that have been helpful within Canada and a few other places.
So we have one.
Keep going. Keep going. Don't give up.
We have one final question. Anat, you had a question about challenges and overcoming them.
Hi, yes, thank you. I'm Dr. Anat Stern from the Israeli Military Colleges. I'm a military historian by trade, so an academic here with all you practitioners. I wanted to ask, thank you so much, Ambassador, for joining us, and thank you, Israela and Tanya, for organizing this, this meeting. And we've heard Israela describe our challenges and how difficult it is for us. And although I'm sure everybody's sitting in and listening, I'm very, very jealous of what is going on in Canada. I mean, we wish it was like that. I'm sure you have faced some challenges at your work, because all we can think of in Israel is the opposition and all the, you know, the difficulties, etc., that Israel described so well. So if you could maybe describe or tell us about a challenge and how you overcame it, and that would, I think, give us a little hope. So thank you for that.
Thank you. That's a great question. And I should temper how beautifully I'm framing everything that's going on here. I don't want to leave the impression, as I said, that everything's flowery, that things are great, without exception, et cetera. Like, we still have a lot of challenges. I think this isn't necessarily an inspirational story, but I think the biggest challenge right now that we have is getting people to bump this thinking up on their priority list. So I think for the most part, we are at a stage, and again, many exceptions, but where most people in government and outside think there is value in inclusion and diversity of voices, for the most part, at least those in policymaking positions. I think the biggest challenge that we have is saying, when a crisis hits, or as we have diminishing resources, or you have a very short time to brief a senior official, or you're teaching a class and you know your students are antsy and they want, you know, you only have a limited amount of readings that you can do, how to make sure that people prioritize this theme. And so the only way around that, I think sometimes, I guess two things I'd say is, one, making sure people know the extent to which their bosses support the agenda or the issue. And you know, it matters a lot if they know that the minister, in our case, cares about it. And if the minister will go on a trip and there's nothing in an agenda or proposed schedule for him, in this case, our current Minister of Foreign Affairs, if there are dinners or events planned and there aren't sufficient, you know, sometimes there are fewer than half women, the minister will ask about it. The minister will ask a question about it and urge others to do it. So knowing the boss cares really matters. And then secondly, we're still trying to make all the arguments about how it relates to the broader strategy and not present it as a separate thing. So not say your priority here are, you know, reforming the military and stabilizing the economy and women, peace, and security. These are your top two priorities. How does inclusion fit within those? So not separating it out and letting it be listed separately. So that may not be too inspiring, but I do want to kind of emphasize the point that we talked about earlier with Etty. And I think with any great movement, with any great social change, and someone told me this once, that inclusive security, you face the most resistance right before your greatest breakthroughs. And so the fact that there is resistance to this movement in many ways, I think, is a positive symbol of the fact that people are taking it seriously and they view it as threatening and they're not marginalizing it, which means once you do get through the door, it won't be completely like ignored. The fact that people at least take it seriously enough to oppose it and to resist it can be a positive sign. And in many great movements, that's when you know, the biggest resistance comes before the biggest great breakthrough. So it's not going to be a linear path. It hasn't been here and it won't be here going forward. But the fact that so many people are engaged can turn around to be something positive.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay, I think it's time to wrap it up. We're really on time. So Israela or Ambassador O'Neill, if you want to say a few final words. And
I will give the last word to the ambassador, and I will just say that it was a pleasure for me to do it, and I now am more convinced than ever of the importance of the activities of civil society in general and Forum Dvorah in particular. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you very much.
I'd say the exact same. I'm so grateful to you for having invited me. I'm so glad that my colleagues from Ottawa and from Tel Aviv are on the line. You know, you have a direct line to them. And I'm as convinced as ever of the need for groups like Forum Dvorah to do its work, and just wish you all the best and do not give up. Just do not give up.
thank you so much. It's been really fascinating. I think we have our work cut out for us and lots of cooperation ahead of us. Really thank you so much for everyone for joining us. I put my email and our website down at the bottom, so feel free to stay in touch, whoever isn't already in touch with us. And I hope that we'll be able to get together in another year and already have a national action plan and have some progress down the line. So thank you very much, and Shana Tova to all of us who are celebrating as well.
Thanks,
Shana Tova.
everybody.
And much health to everyone.
Agreed. Be safe.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.